Preparing a scene for light baking involves putting together all the different elements that compose a bake. We need to make sure we have a light probe group in our scene. On the environment object, I've put a light probe group, and I've spaced the light probes around in the scene on both the X and Z axes on the floor plane and also on the Y axis to make sure that they're spread in 3 dimensions. If you need a light probe group, you can always add one in by choosing Add Component and under Rendering, choose Light Probe Group. I've got these spread around, at least as tall as my characters will be, the dynamic objects that will sample the baked lighting at those points. If you need more probes, if you discover that the lighting is not quite a match once you get into playing the game, you can always add a probe into that group and move it around. I've clicked Add Probe. I'll pull it up out of the floor and pull it over in my scene. We've got our probe position here in the inspector, and we can see it connected by those purple lines in that scene. Next, we need to make sure we have reflection probes. We can add reflection probes on static objects and dynamic ones. I've put a reflection probe here on this robot. I'll press F to frame in on that selection, and we can see in here that the reflection probe is defined by this wireframe cube. We can edit our reflection probes by clicking on the Edit Probe button and pulling the sides around, much the way we'd pull around a collider. We can also move this probe if we need and move the object back. In this case, this probe type is set to baked. That is, that the cube map will bake once and not recalculate. We can also set the probes then for dynamic objects. I've put one on my sphere here, and we can see in this that that reflection probe is set to real time, that every frame it will update that probe. What we need to do in here is to balance then our quality against how many probes we're dealing with and how real-time they are or not. Later, when we make characters, if they have components that need to reflect, we can add reflection probes on them. For most of the objects here in the scene, though, we need to put in a baked probe. I'll put one on the blocks here to show this. I've got my blocks object selected, or rather, one block. What I'll do is choose Add Component, and under Rendering, Reflection Probe. I'll add a reflection probe on, and we can see it very large here in the scene, defined by that wireframe cube. We can size this down, and I'm going to leave it set as baked, as this only needs a slight reflection on the plastic surface of this block, really calculated once. What we can also do in here is to calculate the reflection at a certain resolution. Because this scene has lots of objects that are a little bit reflective, they're slightly shiny, we don't need a terrific reflection resolution. We can see here that I've got the reflection set at 128, and I'll try this out and see how it looks. For things that are more matte, where the reflection is almost showing up as a bit of a color bounce, we can even put this down to 64. I'll leave it in, and I'll add reflection probes on to more objects in the scene, looking carefully at how shiny or glossy that material is. We might see here on the stool, where the legs are maybe a soft brush metal or something similar, that the stool material, being a standard shader, needs a little bit more of a reflection. I'll roll up the stool material and choose Add Component, Rendering, and Reflection Probe. There's the probe, and I'm going to let it reach up almost to the bottom of the stool. This way it doesn't capture the missing underside as part of the reflection. We can always fine-tune if needed, depending on how the bake works. Depending on what we see in the lighting level, we may need more intensity or less in our reflection. For now, I'll leave it and get my bake set up. Under Window and Lighting, we've got Auto Check, and this means that Unity will continuously build our lighting as we make changes in the scene. What I'll make sure I've got set here are as follows. The ambient source is from the skybox, that wraparound sky we've configured with that nighttime purple. The ambient GI will be real time, with an ambient intensity right now of 1. We'll take our reflection source from the skybox for the moment and see how it looks. The reflection resolution will be 128 with a default compression. What we also need to add in here, in our baked GI then, is the ambient occlusion. I'll pull up the ambient occlusion, roughly starting around 1, and we'll see how it looks. Ambient occlusion is the blocking of bounced light by adjacent objects. Corner darkness is a way we can think of it, where objects look grounded by proximity shadows. We can play with the distance if we need, and this is a big reason why scale is so important in the scene. This max distance is 1 meter. That is, things will cast ambient occlusion on each other 1 meter out. In this particular scene, with our characters being 2 meters tall, this should work nicely, but we need to check it and see if we've got too much darkness going on or not enough. We can bring up and down the ambient occlusion amount to increase or decrease the ambient occlusion, and we can also play with the max distance, broadening the distance at which adjacent objects cast shadows on each other. If you'd like, you can also use Final Gather, and this will allow the light to bounce and regather across adjacent surfaces. We'll leave it alone for the moment and let the build continue. Once this build finishes, we'll see our baked lighting in our light maps and really get that color and light bounce in our scene. We can always come back and edit our lights if we need to really push the look of this scene. Right now what we're seeing is that most of our lights are fairly default in how they bounce. I've selected one of my fill lights, and we can see that the intensity is 0.8, but the bounce intensity is 1.1. So this light will have a little extra bounce to it, a little extra contributing purple in the scene. And this is something that may take some testing to really balance out. I'll let that bake process. I'll come back and evaluate it. I may even put in a test player and check it out, or hit play and see how it looks in the scene. Really pushing around the look by playing with the bounce intensity of my lights, and also the ambient occlusion and strength of it in the lighting window.